Welcome to the Consider This channel. Consider This is a free to subscribe to channel where we look at the world's oldest questions, and by using all data to hand, we offer evidence to a realistic conclusion. Whether you use this channel to support your own studies, or simply listen to it while hoovering, all are welcome. This is Chapter 2 of Evidence of Soul. If you have not yet watched Chapter 1, may I advise you do. Now, let's get into it. Evidence of Soul by Sharon Patrice. Chapter 2. Erasmus Darwin. In the recently unearthed, monolithic ruins of Göbekli Tepe near Şanlıurfa, in the southeast Anatolia region of modern-day Turkey, which archaeologists have dated to the pre-pottery Neolithic era, between 11,500 to 10,000 years ago, several curious stone holes were uncovered. World-acclaimed, legendary archaeologist, Professor Klaus Schmidt, who headed excavations at Göbekli Tepe between 1995 until his premature death in 2014, proposed the stone's holes were elenlocks, a Germanic word translated into English as soul holes. The stones are around 18.5 inches, that's around 1/2 a meter in diameter, and were originally set either in or on the ring walls of the now lost enclosures, or perhaps in overhead ceilings, also now lost. One of these elenlocks has been pieced back together and is now on display at Şanlıurfa Archaeological Museum. So, what function, exactly, does a perceived soul hole serve? To get into the mindset of our Göbekli Tepe ancestors, all those thousands of years ago, we need to look further into what is known or detected in their history. We acknowledge, and it is accepted by mainstream archaeologists and scientists in the field of human development, that these people were at the forefront of farming, some 12,000 even 13,000 years ago, give or take a few years. Farming, as we know it to today, was introduced to Europe through tight-knit waves of migration, about 8,500 years ago, by people originating from Anatolia and the surrounding areas. It started to spread across the continent, eventually reaching Central Europe by around 7,500 years ago. This was not a word-of-mouth transfer of living or survival habits and techniques. These were people uprooting from their land of birth, tracking with their families, young and old, into an unknown territory, seeking new pastures to farm vegetation and raise their herds, taking with them knowledge and beliefs. However, we should not romanticize these ancient people. Let us not forget, they also murdered on their travels to claim those pastures, almost completely wiping out the original hunter-gatherers native to Europe. DNA evidence clearly, and without doubt, shows these teacher farmers originating from Anatolia and surrounding areas, and were related to the direct descendants of the Göbekli Tepe builders and original farmers of the encompassing area. Certainly, they built on their ever-increasing knowledge of farming, when to plant, and when to harvest, for example, but more than that, there is direct physical cogent evidence of at least one of their burial rites/beliefs, and it is found in antediluvian burial sites on the island of Ireland and throughout Europe, referenced as a soul hole. The so-named soul hole, literally a stone with a hole in the middle, was placed in numerous burial structures, accepted, by some, to be a safeguard, where the self, ego or soul could slip in and out of the living world, if so desired. Of course, nobody really knows what the soul hole represented, or indeed, if it has anything to do with the perception of soul. But, if the only argument in this instance is a theory made by a world-famous, well-respected archaeologist, we should at the very least put it to one side under the notion of suspected religious ideology or practices attributed to the world's first farmers, and remember it is there. There are so many worldwide traditions, known to us today, that reference the soul's journey. Some are slightly different from others, but the point is, the one common denominator in all is the practice of deposition of the flesh body, both in ancient religions and new, which appears to be based on the belief that a part of ourselves lives on after the death of the physical body. It would be arguable that this belief is a human creation, a comforting story we tell ourselves. However, archaeological digs have brought forth weighty evidence of ritualistic burials, not only by us humans, but also by our archaic cousin, Homo neanderthal, who did not just bury their dead, but, as seen in some unearthed graves, useful or personal objects known as burial goods, were placed alongside their departed loved ones, supposedly, to take on the soul's journey. Some Neanderthal burials have been discovered to date back to around 50,000 years ago. These are not theories about the graves of Neanderthal, but solid archaeological, see it with your own eyes, the fact. It's mind-blowing when we appreciate not only Homo sapiens, that's us, believe that a part of self, the souls, lives on after death, but that our cousins, who diverted from our own branch of the evolutionary tree hundreds of thousands of years ago, also believed in soul. Even further back. It was South Africa in the year 2013. A pair of cave explorers, Rick Hunter and Stephen Tucker, of the Speleological Exploration Club, were investigating a cave system, known locally and on maps as the Rising Star, which sits around 30 miles. That's around 42.2 kilometers, northwest of Johannesburg, and what they observed added yet another cousin to the hominin line, one that up until then had not been realized. This newly discovered hominin, now named Homo naledi, had shorter arms than us, and a brain around one-third the size of a modern human brain. It's generally believed to have lived between 500 and 2,450,000 years ago in Africa, which would have been, toward the later part of their existence, contemporary to the newly emerged Homo sapiens. The world of archaeology and paleoanthropology was empowered with enthusiasm, and, soon after the discovery, Lee Rogers Berger, an American-born, South African paleoanthropologist, and National Geographic explorer-in-residence at the University of Witwatersrand, in Johannesburg, led a team of scientists on multiple excavations of the underground caves, during which they found bones from at least 27 individuals, attributed to the newly named Homo naledi. Berger and his colleagues published their introductory findings in 2015. You can find this on elifesciences.org. In it he noted the skeletal remains covered the ground of a cavity deep inside the cave. Further trips deeper into the underground cave system, at a point exceedingly difficult to gain access, read that as near impossible to reach, revealed two near-whole skeletal remains. An analysis of sediments and rock from what was considered by seasoned archaeologists to be the burial chamber concluded these Homo naledi did not simply deposit corpses to this location, they buried their beloved deceased in the cave, then carved perceived artwork on the walls to mark those graves. Further findings were released on June 5, 2023 and concluded the Homo naledi anatomy indicates that, though they were capable of long-distance travel, with a modern human upright-like stride, they were more adapted to an arboreal way of life. In other words, this particular hominin cousin was far better adapted to climbing trees and suspensory behavior than the strength needed to stay upright and run. The naledi's tooth composition suggests at least part of their diet was made up of gritty foods, or foods with dusty particles attached, possibly suggesting a diet of tubular roots, maybe even nuts and seeds. For us today, that would be turnips, spring onions, potatoes, beetroots and anything else we dig out of the dirt to eat, and, of course, nuts and seeds are readily available from the poshest supermarkets to the local corner shop. Let us remember the graves of our cousin hominin were dated to the Middle Pleistocene, which is around 335 to 236,000 years ago, and an offshoot from our own direct DNA line. We are told Homo naledi have not been associated with stone tools or any indication of material culture so far found at the site, but they do appear to have been dexterous, that is to say, handy and intelligent enough to produce and handle stone tools. After all, how could they have carved decorations onto the rock cave burial chamber without the knowledge of at least one stone tool? It has also been hypothesized by those knowledgeable these skeletal remains were given funerary rites and were carried into and placed in the chamber. Furthermore, it has been proposed, with authority, Homo naledi used fire for light and cooking of food. Us humans are the tail end result of all hominin to date, and are the hominin branch of the tree of life that survived and populated this planet. So, where did the concept of soul come from? We may now appreciate it is not wholly a human idea. Indeed, it may well be a thought or practice passed down to us by our distant cousins, but who passed it to them? Or did they make it up? Looking at the occurrence of life on planet Earth is a reasonable place to start our search, in the quest for evidence toward the concept of soul. If the soul is indeed an intricate component of life, as is believed by many world traditions, dating back thousands upon thousands of years, possibly, passed onwards from our hominin cousins, then we must look to the beginnings of life as we know it, and work our way forward. Out of Africa. As most folks are aware, it has long since been supposed, we Homo sapiens formulated our well-defined DNA profile in the continent of Africa, through an exceedingly lengthy line of genetic mutation that started Homo sapiens on their own, distinct, DNA journey around 400,000 to 245,000 years ago. These mutations took us away from our nearest cousins like Neanderthal and Denisovans, and, as far as we are aware, we are the only remaining, and, last mutation, on the hominin tree to populate this world, to date. That is not to say we are the endmost. How we arrived at our distinct Homo sapiens lineage, as we understand it to be today, was, in fact, only acknowledged when the English naturalist Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, stated that all known species or organisms, read that as plant life, mammal, fish, bird, and yes, even bacterium, developed through a natural selection of small and inherited variations that increased the individual life form's ability to compete, survive, and reproduce. This, we are advised, originally occurred between 4.42 billion years ago to 3.7 billion years ago. The earliest, unswerving evidence of life on Earth is from microfossils of microorganisms, from 3.465 billion-year-old rocks, give or take a few years, found in Australia and Greenland. Taking in all scientific indication, we are shown the first microorganism life forms were in fact of a single-cell nature. These primitive tiny organisms released oxygen via a system we now describe as photosynthesis, which gradually built up within planet Earth's atmosphere. Eventually, the amount of oxygen released gave way to the evolution of oxygen-dependent life forms, of which the Homo sapiens lineage, along with millions of other living forms of fauna and flora, are derived. Oxygen is now the Earth's most abundant element, and most life that we observe today depends on oxygen for its precise existence. A short poem by Erasmus Darwin, 1731 to 1802, titled The Temple of Nature. Penned in 1802. Organic life beneath the shoreless waves. Was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms minute, unseen by spheric glass. Move on the mud, or pierce the watery mass. These, as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire and larger limbs assume, whence countless groups of vegetation spring, and breathing realms of fin and feet and wing. Erasmus Darwin was the paternal grandfather of the world-acclaimed theorist, Charles Darwin, think evolution of species. Erasmus, an Englishman, was known as one of the leading intellectuals of the 18th century Western world. He was a well-respected physician, philosopher, botanist, naturalist, and poet. Through his observations of life, he brought about his theory of an evolution of beings. This was not the only activity Erasmus is known for. He was also a leader in an intellectual community that contributed to the emergence of the industrial era. Unfortunately, Erasmus appears to have become ostracized from society for writing about his beliefs of mutation, bringing forth an evolution to all known life forms. In short, he was laughed at. His life's work may well have been accepted if it had not gone against the traditional Christian beliefs, in an era where religion ruled supreme, and science came an embarrassing second. Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, Erasmus's grandson, is best known for his own theory of evolution by natural selection. A theory he built on from his grandfather's work. The conclusion he came to was again in direct conflict with socially accepted standard concepts, and like his grandfather found, his theories were at best laughed at worst condemned. To bolster his supposition and offer scientific proof, he decided to assemble yet more evidence of a factual nature that could not easily be dismissed, before going all out and publicizing his findings. After numerous years of research, travel and documented details, Charles published his book explaining his well-thought-out theory entitled On the Origin of Species in 1859, in which he described how single-cell organisms evolved over many generations, taking many millions of years through the inheritance of physical or behavioral traits. Coming back to the modern day, for a moment, I am reminded of the internationally acclaimed body language expert, the ever-fabulous Mr. Greg Hartley. Hartley has a saying well known to his followers: the organism does what made the organism successful, and that is the point to Darwin's theory of evolution. Charles Darwin's theory starts with the premise that within a population, there is variation in trait. The theory gained general acceptance, after a time, in both scientific and archaeological circles, and Darwin attracted many followers. One such follower, who promoted Darwin's work, was a German zoologist, naturalist, eugenicist, philosopher, physician, professor, marine biologist, and artist, by the name of Ernst Heinrich Philipp August Haeckel, 1834 to 1919. Haeckel discovered, named, and often drew thousands of new species which, in time, lead to him mapping out a representation of a genealogical tree of life. Haeckel's paleontological tree of vertebrates, produced around 1879, concluded with the acceptance of Darwin's theory, and show all life forms are descended from an original life form, a life form that spread throughout our planet, changing through mutation to survive and adapt to different living conditions. How that life form came about is an absorbing subject, and one that brings about heated debate, but that we will look at in a later chapter. After all, if we are made from matter, surely the soul must be too. For now, in order to get a clear picture of us humans, let us concentrate on the tree of man and his hominin ancestors. It is no secret that Homo sapiens are believed to have developed from the same mutations that brought about the ape, specifically, chimpanzees, toward the end of the Miocene era 9.3 million to 6.5 million years ago, give or take. The Miocene era ranges from 23.03 million years ago to around 5.333 million years ago, and, perhaps, in time, our science will evolve to produce more evidence to show how we actually got to the stage of our early ancestral chimpanzees. Archaeological evidence appears to show Homo neanderthal, our genetic cousin, walked out of the original homeland of Africa, and traveled through northeast Africa, onto the Arabian Peninsula, then traveled on, to settle in Europe and Eurasia, from around 800,000 to 400,000 years ago, before our own hominin species had even developed. The general theory is they became extinct, in both Europe and Eurasia around some 40,000 years ago, although there is wide debate, with many academics suggesting the Neanderthal lived on for several thousand years more. The considered suggestion they died out from interaction with Homo sapiens may unhappily be true. We are assured there appears to have been several times early human ancestors left Africa on their travels to find wider opportunities, possibly beginning as early as 270,000 years ago. Fossilized bone has been attributed to early Homo sapiens throughout modern-day Greece, some 215,000 years ago, and as far away as the area we now know as China, around 80,000 years ago. However, archaeology combined with scientific DNA studies show this early expansion of humans became extinct, or perhaps they simply retreated. We have no way of knowing. What we do know is they ceased to be in the original areas found. Furthermore, it is believed present-day humans, that's you and me, descend from one single migration out of our supposed homeland continent of Africa, around 70 to 50,000 years ago, taken as an average of 60,000 years ago. Indeed, it is well documented, through archaeological and DNA data, that every human alive today is a direct descendant from that singular migration some 60,000 years ago. The accepted out of Africa timeline supposes around 150 to 1,000 people crossed through the Middle Eastern Peninsula from northeast Africa before spreading throughout Eurasia, and then on to occupy the entire planet. Let's just sit here a short while and let that sink in. Between only 150 to 1,000 Homo sapiens left Africa some 60,000 years ago, and now we populate the entire planet. But, and there is always a but. Newish archaeological reports shout loudly, with a determined suggestion that the birthplace of Homo sapiens may be somewhere in or around the Mediterranean area, and not in fact Africa. I say newish, because even though the first discovery unearthed in 1944, with further discoveries, attributed to the same pre-human hominin excavate in 2017, the interpretation of what the discoveries actually mean has brought about a bare-knuckle argument of words, and theories persists as to the meaning of such finds. If this should turn out to be true, it would sit all theories on the development of hominin down on their bottoms, and demand we start from ground zero and work our way back up again. The story so far. A serious investigation and scientific analysis of two very ancient fossils of a pre-Homo sapiens tooth and lower jawbone, unearthed near Pyrgos Vassilissus, Greece, dated to 7.2 million years ago, has thrown the previously and widely accepted theory of out of Africa as the birthplace of modern humans into uncertainty. The evidence appears to indicate this pre-human ape-like being, of which the fossils belongs, was the oldest known pre-human and far outdates all other known hominin so far unearthed in Africa. This newly discovered ancestor has been given the all but unpronounceable name of Homo Greekopithecus freybergi. Greekopithecus freybergi has been described as an extinct genus of hominid that lived in Southeast Europe during the late Miocene era around 7.2 million years ago, and was originally identified by a single lower jaw portion, bearing a molar tooth. Further fossilized tooth material was discovered in the Izmaca quarry in Bulgaria in 2012. In 2017, an international team of paleontologists, led by Professor Madeleine Bohm of the Eberhard Karls University Tübingen, Germany, published a detailed analysis of the teeth and age of the specimens, Greekopithecus freybergi, and came to the conclusion that it could be the oldest hominin, meaning that it could be the oldest direct ancestors of us humans, after splitting from that of the chimpanzee. Their study also claimed, contrary to the generally accepted evidence of the African origin of the hominin lineage, the ancestors of humans originated from the main ape ancestry in the Mediterranean area before migrating into Africa, where they evolved into the ancestors of Homo species. Greekopithecus freybergi is said to be several hundred to 1,000 years older than the most ancient potential human ancestor, discovered in Africa, Homo sahelanthropus chadense, unearthed in Chad, near Central Africa. The deduction is that humans split from their ape cousins, present-day chimpanzees, not in Africa, as had been widely assumed, but in Europe. A member of the international research team from the University of Tübingen in Germany, Johann Fuss, stated, "We were surprised by our results, as pre-humans were previously known only from sub-Saharan Africa." The Greekopithecus fossils, described in the journal Public Library of Science 1, were found to have dental traits seen in modern humans, early humans and pre-humans, but not great apes. Computer tomography, or CT, scans were used to visualize the internal structure of the tooth and jawbone. Lead researcher, Professor Madeleine Bohm, said, while great apes typically have 2 or 3 separate and diverging roots, the roots of Greekopithecus converge and are partially fused, a feature that is characteristic of modern humans, early humans, and several pre-humans including Ardipithecus and Australopithecus. Co-author, Professor David Begun, from the University of Toronto, in Canada, said, "This dating allows us to move the human-chimpanzee split into the Mediterranean area." The creation of savanna conditions in Europe, confirmed by the discovery of grass-derived plant silicate particles, called phytoliths, coincided with the emergence of the Sahara Desert in North Africa. Of course, it must be remembered, there were no borders 7.2 million years ago, no passport scrutiny, nor luggage inspections. Animals, much as today, ran freely and ran to where their food was plentiful. Plants do the same thing. One plant variety may be happy growing high upon mountainous uplands, where another plant species may find life easier under the seas. As far as our search for soul is concerned, it matters not where, or even when, the human race diverted its DNA from chimpanzees, but rather, where and when it first started to bury its dead, with burial rites, suggesting the belief that a part of their dearly departed lived on. Determining when our human, rather than hominin cousins, ancestors first began burying their dead is an extraordinary challenging task. To date, we humans have unearthed what must be considered the oldest burial by Homo sapiens known to us so far. The burials are dated to around 100,000 years ago, and consist of up to 15 humans. They were discovered during excavations of a cave in Kafsa, located at the base of Mount Precipice, within the Jezreel Valley of Lower Galilee, south of Nazareth, in the historic area of Israel, during the 1930s and 1960s. Among some of the finds, on site, were stoves and stone tools, belonging to the Mousterian culture. The Mousterian is an archaeological industry of stone tools making, associated chiefly with the Neanderthals in Europe, and early anatomically modern humans in North Africa. Both human and animal bones were found, which attest to the fact that the cave had been used, both for residence and as a burial site. 7 of the 15 human skeletal remains were those of adults, and the rest of children. 5 of these skeletons were found buried in an orderly fashion within the cave's floor, one being the remains of a 12 to 13-year-old boy, found with European fallow deer horns next to his chest. He had been placed in a rectangular grave, carved out of the bedrock, with his arms folded alongside his body, and his hands placed on either side of his neck. It is considered the deer horns were likely placed as an offering, to who or which god we will never know, or perhaps a useful tool for the afterlife. Isolated bones and teeth, found in the cave, have been attributed to at least 28 people. Remains of a young male and a child were found in a double burial. An additional and all-important find were the remains of ochre on human bones. Ochre is a natural clay pigment used like body paint and for ornamentation. It appears this type of body art was also used to decorate the bones of the deceased. It was also used during the burial of a brain-damaged child that was found in the cave. Red, black, and yellow ochre-painted seashells were found in various locations around the cave, all of which appear to be associated with burial practices, which indicates that ceremonial funerary rites that included symbolic acts, which held special meaning, had already been common around 100,000 years ago. As new archaeological finds are dug up, and the scientifically minded folk perceive or argue against what those finds represent, I have always, wholeheartedly, only considered the facts of those new finds. Theories are great, but, by their very nature, only stand in for realism until a theory can be proven as fact, and, for that very reason, they should be put to one side and remembered as needs be. Yet, after thousands of years of interbreeding with, and learning from our Homo neanderthal, Homo denisovan, and other hominin cousins, we still, to this day, do not know for sure. To clarify, we cannot say from a scientific vantage point, the soul exists. We simply believe it may. Our earliest clue, to date, are the burial practices of our cousin Homo naledies, and, let us remember the graves they prepared and decorated were dated to the Middle Pleistocene, which is around 335,000 to 236,000 years ago. The question must remain, did we learn that a part of ourself lives on from Naledi, or did they copy their newly developed cousins, the Homo sapiens, practices, or perhaps they gained knowledge of soul through a separate hominin species? In 1959, there were around 3 billion people in our world. Within 40 years, the world's population had doubled to 6 billion. Today, 2023, there are 9 billion people alive, some of which, you can be sure, are planning to reproduce. If we keep up this pattern of biological process, there will likely be an impressive 12 billion by 2043. Obviously, the population will not always multiply by 3 billion every 20 years. Sometimes it may dip, other times it may well surpass all expectations, which may in turn lead to perhaps 5 billion every 20 years? This overpopulation will, of course, bring about numerous problems, some of which may well prove unsurmountable. For the sake of this book, those problems will not worry us today. What we will investigate are the 9 billion souls around nowadays. Thank you for watching. Now head over to Chapter 3 to continue the fascinating quest to find evidence of soul. But before you go, please remember to subscribe. It's free. Hit that like button and subscribe. Apparently, it helps my algorithms.